I think a lot of my viewers have probably noticed at this point that I don't take a traditional line of argumentation to try to convince someone to alter their religious or philosophical perspective. In the past, whenever I had my claim to fame as a Christian apologist and I worked on a college campus and I did all that cool stuff, my approach was to offer, say, classical arguments for God's existence and then add a splash of, like, say, the historicity of the Bible, maybe some text in the New Testament, argue for some dating of some of the writings in the New Testament. And then, of course, try to emphasize something akin to like Gary Habermas's minimal facts approach to the resurrection of Jesus. And it was pretty potent. I mean, I was really well known for that. And at the time, I used to make jokes about like, certain religions are more or less convincing based on certain assumptions. And I'll admit now, looking back at say 2014, 15, I was a bit naive, to say the least. Now, as I say, my approach is not the same anymore. I think that almost anyone can take advantage of so-called classical arguments for God's existence. And I don't know, I'm sort of the opinion, I've talked about this a million times on here now, I'm sort of the opinion now that most of the people who converted to Christianity underneath my apologetics, ministerial, whatever that was, already had inclinations towards belief. Most of them more sort of not unchurched, but they were sort of de-churched. They had left the church, but still had Christian inclinations, as most people do. It wasn't really the South, but it's Kentucky. It's like LARPing the South, but it's a blue state, whatever, right? And so, yeah, I think most people already had sort of these inclinations towards belief in God, and I think that that's extremely important. And it's also been something I've thought about for a really long time since leaving Christianity and converting to another faith altogether. Now, I say that because my approach now is mostly trying to appeal to people's innate intuitive values, right? Because I think it's those things that actually drive people to make decisions about deeply religious matters. I actually saw a friend on Facebook today talk about how our experience drives our reason. And I think that's true. I think it's our experiences of reality that supplant these deep entrenched values in us. And then we arrive, in effect, at logical conclusions about those values via reason, right? And so, I know, controversial. The reason why I bring all this up is because recently I've been having a plethora of conversations on YouTube, on Facebook, on other platforms. Even in my day-to-day life, I have these conversations, and they've happened on various accounts, but lately they've kind of had an uptick, and I can only imagine it's because I've took a month off from YouTube and came back. But basically, in these conversations, these are people of religious, better yet, more specifically, these people are Christian or Muslim, and typically, most people who comment on my channel who are like Hindus, we're not at odds. I don't know what that is. I assume it's some polytheistic bent, but we're never at odds, right? We disagree about the color of the picture, but ultimately we still agree that there's multiple pictures there. So I guess maybe to give something of an analogy. Whereas I guess for Christians and Muslims, we're not even reading the same picture book, right? So I've noticed that in these conversations that my angle now has changed trajectories, and what I try to do is to get underneath assumptions and to get straight to a person's deeply held values. Now, I think this takes great effect whenever you start talking about the nature of God, right? Like when we start talking about what is God like, what is God's character, and ultimately, sort of behind that is, why the heck would we worship this God to begin with? I think if you're an atheist watching this channel, you're probably wanting some kind of gratuitous evidence. And, we could get lost in the sauce about why I don't think that that's necessarily needed. Well, I guess if we use a very general notion of evidence, maybe we could suggest there is evidence for God. But I think for all intents and purposes, most people who take that line, especially on the internet, do not have a genuine intent, sort of a bad faith argument, and I don't really have an interest in sort of getting lost in that. What I will say is that on the face of it, I think the belief in God is something like a natural belief, something that is properly basic, some philosophers would say, and given to intuition. I think we are naturally geared to believe in God. Does that necessarily mean that God exists? No, no. But I think that there is something to that. And I think that underneath that is a real reality. I think there is a real reality to the belief in God. And I think that unless we're given some alternative, some persuasive argument otherwise, I don't really see a good reason to deny our natural intuitions on this. To move past that, though, most of the exchanges I've had recently with Christians and Muslims, mostly Christians, I should be clear. Actually, back up. Before I even talk about Christianity, Christianity gets the hot button on here, and that's not really fair. And that's just because I have so much knowledge about Christianity. I am a dude in the West. I was born in America, specifically in the South. So, of course, I'm going to have more of an experience with Christianity, and Christianity's been under the academic limelight for a really, really long time, and Islam is just now seeing its day in the sun. Give it a couple more years and enough textual criticism, and Islam will be off the map too. But the reason why I don't give a lot of space to Islam, for those who ask a million times on here, because we all know it's not true. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to be real. We want to talk about values. We want to talk about things that we consider to be of grave moral importance, things that we highly, highly prize, things that we keep very near and dear to us. Islam is so vastly counterintuitive, and honestly, internalistically condemnable. And so that's why, I hate to just say because it's fake, but yeah, that's the deal. Islam has a rich tradition that also literally spans like 2 weeks. It's not been around a long time, and half the things it has to say has already been said by other people, and those people are telling anyways. So that's why I don't give a lot of space here to say Islam. I don't consider it very serious, and I would say that those who, very few, Abdullah Kundi, Australian Muslim, he's probably the most articulate I've ever seen, very respectable. Takes something like a presuppositional approach to Islam. I can appreciate that, and he certainly seems very admirable and honorable, and I appreciate some of the reasons he's offered for why he's a Muslim, none of which are convincing. Beyond that, though, what's there to offer? And so, obviously, most of my dialogues are with Christians. That's the primary bulk of people that I know. And what I would say is that the big driving force in those conversations is the focus on God's character. But I try not to be too heavy-handed with just focusing on God's character in the Old Testament. I want to give a little bit of limelight to God's character in the New Testament as well. I'm not trying to spread some Gnostic propaganda. Let's take them together. What I would say is that we need to be focusing very heavily, I think, on the fact that Christians are, at bottom, worshiping a God who commands child slaughter, like wholesale child slaughter in the Old Testament. And I think that needs to be fleshed out. I agree with people like Alex O'Connor who bring that conversation to the forefront, because right now Christians live within this sphere, this echo chamber of superiority, where they still think that Christianity is not just the right position intellectually, that Jesus just is the truth, right? The embodiment of truth, whatever that means. It makes absolutely no sense, considering what truth is literally that which corresponds to reality. It makes no sense to say a person is the truth. But either way, they live in this sort of sphere, this echo chamber, which basically reaffirms for them that they have the sort of moral superiority, like moral high ground. And I'm not just talking about, say, like presuppositionalists who are arguing in circles with themselves about, how they just know their position's right. I'm talking about like just general run-of-the-mill Christian, even those who are, say, like laity. It's always sort of an offhand conversation or off-putting conversation whenever I meet somebody like this, and their first reaction is like, well, why wouldn't you be a Christian? And my response is, I have children. I love my children. Why would I want to raise them believing God's evil? And there it is. Most people are not going to hear that in a conversation. And where are you left to go? At least for those I've engaged with before, whenever I bring up, say, these really condemnable acts that are commanded by Yahweh in the Old Testament, Normatively, I'm met with a slew of answers. Some people are dodgy. Most Christians are very, very dodgy about the circumstances surrounding the context of that. Granted, there are people like William Lane Craig. I've got a video where I talk about William Lane Craig and his horrendous view that God is absolutely justified in commanding child slaughter, and it's a good thing. Let that sink in. But there's a variety of people that don't know that's there. Excuse me. And I think that's handy to bring out. Like, that's the God you're worshiping. Certainly, I know that most laity are just going to say, the Bible, it's weird, it's wacky. But yeah, it's your weird and wacky book. And Christianity is unique, at least for most Christians. Christianity is unique of being this religion of the book, kind of like Islam, where if the book says it, that's sort of heavy, right? It's not like, say, in general paganism or even in Zoroastrianism, where the text itself is sort of supplementary to the faith and practice itself. I oftentimes think of, say, like Zarathustra and the Gathas. The Gathas are certainly like authoritative, but ultimately it's like Zarathustra's handing us a method of philosophy to adhere to, sort of like a philosophical school, which is not rigidly dogmatic. Now, that is vastly different than, say, Christianity, which is offering quite the opposite. It is offering the rule book, the basic instruction before leaving Earth, as my Protestant friends used to call it. God, that's so cringy. You can definitely tell I was not raised in church culture, but that is what my Protestant friends used to say to me whenever I was a teenager, in and out of youth groups or whatever. But it does need to get brought up, because I think people are too quick to toss it off, too quick to dodge it, and I think that their resort is to say, "Oh, well, Jesus, I interpret the Bible through the lens of Christ," and which is almost like sort of semi-Gnostic. Let's admit it. That's sort of semi-Gnostic. It almost pits sort of the Jesus-y approach against, say, some of the more debauched stuff of the Old Testament. And that is problematic. I'm not saying it's Marcionism, but it certainly borders on Marcionism. And at least some of the conversations I've had recently, where I point out, say things that might be consistent with that, like, Jesus is teaching in contradiction to, say, like the Lex Talionis in the Old Testament. Well, that really undermines the entire premise of Christianity, where Jesus is sort of fulfilling prophecy and law, right? Like, if he's the Messiah and he's basically teaching against these laws, then is he the Messiah then? That becomes problematic. Obviously, he would not be. But even more so to say, like, your middle ground people, like not your William Lane Craigs or your lady, but even in recent conversations I've had with people who basically want to take this. Oh, God, it's a revolving door. Okay, I've heard this a million times. I don't know how many people have brought up to me that their response to the slaughter of the Canaanites or the Amalekites, or however many other people in the Old Testament, is to just say it's hyperbolic, or it's metaphoric, or it's allegorical. More popularized, though, is this sort of hyperbolic exaggeration. This view is coming from Paul Copan. Right? Paul Copan wrote a book years ago called Is God a Moral Monster? You should read it if you haven't read it. And he offers this theory that basically that when God commands very specifically for the Jews to go in and kill men, women, children, even the suckling babies and their farm animals, leave nothing alive, that is kind of an exaggeration. That didn't exactly happen. It's kind of like war rhetoric. Which, I think for some Christians, they read that and they're like, oh, okay. Even my own mentor in college, when I was teaching apologetics, introduced me to that view, and I was even kind of like, oh, interesting. Except there's one big glaring problem. Even if we resort to, say, exterior text and suggest that, look, some of these people that were claimed to be slaughtered and killed, they still exist. That's not the issue. I think we're focusing far too heavily on this idea of genocide in the Old Testament. The issue is that God's commanding Israelite army to literally go in and sack a city, slaughter everyone. And I'm not even saying killing the men is good. I think that that's a horrendous view. I compare it to modern political conversations where you see these guys on this sort of conservative far right who just got this bloodlust for a world war or a civil war, where they're constantly wanting to harm people. And my first question I always ask to these people in political conversations is, why do you so desire to kill people who have children? Why do you want to hurt someone's father or brother? Much more so. Why would you want to harm someone's mother or their children, especially children who are still breastfeeding? That's okay. Couple steps back, getting way too heated here. That was my shoe squeaking on the floor as I try to adjust myself here. Let's face it. Let's face it. If you face some internal constant battle where you desperately want to harm innocent people, I don't know how to break this to you. You're an evil person. You need to get help, right? Now, let's kind of move forward a little bit here. In the Old Testament, God commands specifically, very, very explicitly, so much so that whenever the Israelites fail to do that, and they keep some stuff, don't they keep some people alive and stuff? Either way, by not keeping that command explicitly, God gets pissed, like pissed. Even if there are people left who survived, God commanded explicitly the absolute murder of children, right? You shouldn't have to defend that, right? To defend that also makes you complicit with it. It makes you evil as well. Now, this is a hard line to sell, but this is why I don't argue, if you look at the cosmological argument, it looks more like this God might have done it rather than this God. That's stupid. That's stupid, okay? Maybe there is some intuitiveness of, like, say, the causality of the universe. Maybe there's some intuitiveness to the natural order of the universe. Certainly, I think I love philosophy. I love those conversations. I don't think that's changing anyone's mind. But what should be changing their mind is when you take these values, and that's what I try to do all the time. Don't you value your family? If you have children, don't you love your children? Why would you worship a God who could and has commanded their demise, their harm, your harm? Think about that for a moment, right? Again, Islam sort of off the paradigm. Islam literally teaches causal divine determinism, like divine determinism. Literally all evil events are determined by God. Clearly, I don't know anyone in their rational mind who doesn't look at the God of Islam and doesn't think, okay, yeah, that's an evil demon. Like, that's clearly a demon, at least in Zoroastrian terms, a servant to Druj. Clearly, probably a lower level deity serving Engramenyu Ahriman, right? Clearly has aligned itself with the evil principle. But when we look at Yahweh, for some reason, he gets the pass, and I'm telling you, he should not get the pass. Now, you probably have noticed I am dealing with this on spiritual grounds, right? I'm not coming at this, say, from like a textual critic. I understand. I've gone to school as someone who has dealt with the academics. I understand the Old Testament is written by a variety of different authors and who all have various different takes on what God is like, who God is, etc., etc., etc. The Jewish tradition itself, the Israelite Jewish tradition, vast and diverse, and I respect that. But as it corresponds to Christianity, specifically, of course, I'm dealing with my Protestant friends who I engage with on a regular basis. I cannot for the life of me understand why we keep giving Yahweh the pass and beating around the bush when it becomes so apparent to me that any plain reading of the Bible lands us with Yahweh's evil, clearly. And finally, I'll say that because of recent conversations I've had, I have a lot of clergymen on my social media platforms that I'm friends with in various different denominations, and I always love to get their takes on different things, and I try to be as respectful as possible, even though I do know I drive hard sometimes on these conversations and can be probably a little bit annoying, but that's the fun of it. I have seen this move by some to just completely write that text off in general and say that God just did not command those things at all. I've even heard people within my own peer circle say, because for those who still hold Christian inclinations, that they just don't believe that it has any bearing on their theological perspective at all. And what I would push back and say here is, don't you think it's a bit odd that you have to explain that away? Like, that's even an integral part of your tradition? And if there was some viable alternative, why would you reject it? This is obviously me making the appeal here as someone who is sympathetic to the Zoroastrian position that, as I've joked before, Ahura Mazda is like the most wholesome deity in the ancient world. Almost said ancient Near East. I mean, he is in the ancient Near East, but clearly he was far more expansive than that. Um, why? And see, here's the reason why I ask why is because I know why. I know why. You have some affinity for Christianity because that's how your culture has sort of raised you to believe is that Christianity is sort of the end all be all religion, the good religion. Though frankly, it's not the good. Zoroastrianism has historically been called the good religion. It's trying to make a joke there, but it's because you have some attachment, I think, to the person you imagine is Jesus. But therein lies another red flag problem. I don't think Jesus actually taught anything too radically desirable either. Now, I won't go too far into the woods on this one because I've got too many videos talking about this, but if you're interested in my take on Jesus, I would highly encourage you to scope out my channel. But I've commented many times here that I always say Jesus is mid, borrowing the language of my Gen Z students, but there's some truth to that. Somebody said in one of my comments on YouTube that, I'm just saying that in retrospect because, my entire culture has been developed out of Christianity, and I'm just so accustomed to that. And it's like, are you Tom Holland in disguise? The historian, not the Spider-Man, who is definitely not as good as Tobey Maguire or Andrew Garfield for that matter. Sorry, Gen Z. But here's what I've responded to in that. Pretty much all the good teachings of Jesus, I mean, you could just sum up in Stoicism. Like the ancient Stoics were already saying these things. Like pretty much every school of philosophy prior to Jesus had already said all these radical moral things he says. And the things that Jesus says that are not found in those schools, well, they weren't good. As I've said in many videos before, Jesus is not the family man. He's not compatible or harmonious or supportive of the traditional family. If anything, Jesus offers some pretty destructive teachings. And if you want to see my biggest vendetta against some of the teachings of Jesus, I would encourage you to look at some of my earlier videos or some of the most recent YouTube shorts that I've made, where I'm critiquing this notion of forgiveness that is offered within Christianity, which I think is absolutely destructive and contrary to justice. So yeah, anyways, this has been a ramble fest. But I've just had so many conversations with Christians recently about Yahweh and how Yahweh's character in the Old Testament. I have talked about this at length in other videos, and this is just supplementary to that. But just some thoughts I've had recently about it. I would love to hear what other people think about this stuff. I mean, at this point, this is sort of my linchpin. This is where I go back to, where I try to convince people who are Christian, but who clearly have good intent or of noble heart, right? You know these people who are Christian, but you're like, why? Like, why are you Christian? There are things that are so much better out there. Like, why would you, a family man with children who strive every day to support your family, why would you choose Christianity? Well, we all know why. It's a cultural motif, but ultimately, theologically, it's kind of bankrupt. So my go-to argument now is to really focus in on these value questions, these questions of Yahweh's character, Yahweh's morality. And honestly, I don't find myself getting bogged down anymore with, say, these sort of logic chopping arguments, these deductive arguments. I mean, that was fun back in the heyday. I sound like a high school kid who just lived the party lifestyle. I did not. But it's like back in my college years, I did all these really cool Aristotelian syllogistic arguments. But now I'm just more so focused on practical application. I want to look at the nitty gritty, real application of religion in your day-to-day life. How does it comport? Anyways, this has literally been a yap fest, and so I'm going to cut this video here, but I'd love to see people's opinions. It's just been fresh on my mind. Again, I don't know how many people on Facebook and YouTube I've been having these same conversations with, but I just thought it would be handy to cover some of the old ground maybe.